How do you feel about roguelikes?
I feel really meh about roguelikes. They make me angry, they make me salty, they feel repetitive sometimes, but I have played them more hours than I would like to admit, so I guess it's a love-hate relationship?
I'm right there with you. I absolutely hate the fact that I die in roguelikes and have to start all over again. But I love the fact that once you've figured it out, you feel like a god when you get to the end and destroy the boss. This is Dungeons and Treasure. This is a game that we looked at, I want to say almost a year ago, when it was early alpha. It's a VR title. It's a roguelike, procedurally generated dungeon crawler. And it was fun at the time, but it was also kind of like cartoony fun. Now, it's a little bit more realistic fun. They've definitely improved the everything. The tracking is better, the movement is better, the textures are leaps and bounds from where they were before. The lighting is better, you can see things a lot better. You're not just fighting Jawas anymore, because I tell you what, every enemy was a Jawa. And this is the thing that's really exciting, it has 4-player drop-in multiplayer. You can create a private or public lobby, you can invite friends if you want to, or you can just jump into a random game with up to 4 other players in a roguelike, procedurally generated dungeon crawl.
Every time that I hear multiplayer in a VR title, I get super excited, because that's what I like about gaming more than anything else, is playing with other people. And in VR, it seems like you don't get to do that quite as often as you do with normal games. I could be wrong about that. There are quite a few multiplayer experiences now that I think about it, but I always get excited.
They're all bad. That's the thing. Like, all the multiplayer experiences are bad multiplayer experiences. There's not a whole lot of really good multiplayer experiences. This is a reason why I always end up going back to Elven Assassin, because it's a good multiplayer experience. It's a good co-op experience. It's one of those things that you play and you go, oh, this is fun. It's why we end up going back to Rec Room, because it's a good multiplayer experience. It doesn't matter about anything else, it's just fun. Well, this is a fun game that has multiplayer, so it should be doubly fun.
I don't like roguelikes. I mean, I do, but I don't. But when you say it's in VR, it's like, okay, I guess I'll try it. Like I said with the love-hate thing, I'm like, okay, if this is in VR, I feel like it might be a little more immersive than just starting over at the beginning and it feeling really repetitive, because everything's going to be in a little 3D world. So the idea of it fascinates me, but I just don't know, once I got in and I put the headset on, am I really going to have a lot of fun or not?
And I think in this one you will. This is a fun game. I figured I'd look at it, say, okay, here's what's different, here's what's not, whatever, and then it would get rolled up into a Monday video. But what actually happened is, no, it's a hell of a lot of fun. It's really neat, it's good, and once you figure it out, it's really, really nice. The only thing that I recommend, if you're playing this game, is it starts you off as a classic teleport. And I recommend you turn that off immediately and turn it into trackpad on your hand, not your head. That's weird. Your head should never be a controller. Instead, put it onto the trackpad. And then you can move around and move backwards and stuff like that much easier. It's a good game like that. You pick up your shield, you pick up your crossbow, and you just go out there and you assassinate the world. It's really, really good. I enjoyed this a lot. It felt really well done to me. The only thing I couldn't figure out was, in the previous version, you could use the maps and you could go back and forth between the little teleporty things, and that didn't seem to be working, so maybe it's just because the game's not out yet. I don't know. The game comes out, as of watching this video, yesterday. So you can pick this up right now. It should be on discount for the launch week, but it is a $20 game. At $20, yes, this is worth it. But it does mean it's $80 to get all your friends involved. So it's kind of a weighing, balancing thing there.
I'm actually surprised that you wholeheartedly recommend this for the $20 price tag, because you're kind of a stickler for what developers set prices at. And you know, in VR, a lot of games are really cheap and you can pick them up super cheap. So $20 is actually pretty pricey for a VR title. You must actually really enjoy this if you recommend it at that price. But like you said, you've got to find 3 other people. Well, I guess you could just get a couple, but in order to get the full experience of the 4-person squad, you would have to get 4 people to give $20 for their own title as well. So there is that to consider.
Ah, but there is the drop-in multiplayer as well. So even if you don't have any friends because you're a lonely, horrible person like you, Brax, instead, you can just jump into somebody else's game and ruin it.
Does it have matchmaking where I can just go ruin people's games?
It has matchmaking where you can drop into anybody's game.
Oh yeah, I'm jumping in there to ruin everyone's day.
This game has a lot of really neat things that I'm glad they did. So the original game, essentially, you picked up gold and you could like buy a couple of upgrades at the store if you found it. This is still that kind of a thing. It's got the original Elite kind of feel where you're going to wander around through a maze and maybe you find a store, maybe you find a teleport, maybe you find whatever, and you collect the gold throughout and buy your upgrades in the hopes that you eventually get to a boss, and once you get to the boss, you get to the next area. So it's got that. And it does it really well. It's got, according to the developer, 140 different items in it, including buffs and companions. That's right, you can unlock pets!
What?
How cool is that? You can have a pet. It'll wander around, and it'll buff you.
Yeah, so it helps you fight?
It helps you fight!
Oh yeah, that sounds amazing.
You've got bosses, you've got all sorts of enemies, you've got the multiplayer, you've got different locomotions. It's got a lot of really cool stuff in it. I think this is a game where I've seen where it came from when it was an alpha game back in the day. And I've seen the amount of work that they put into it over the past however many months it's been to get it to this point. And I absolutely can say, yes, they've put in a lot of time and effort, and they've made this a really high-quality game. It's a voxel-based game, which is interesting because I feel like voxels work really well in VR. When you're up close to something and it's got that kind of a voxel appearance, VR doesn't have the highest quality resolution, so you see these voxels and they work really well, and you can see the clear lines of things, whereas when you have all these really complicated shaders and all of that that you expect in a high-quality AAA title, they don't look as good in VR. They just don't. So with this, you've got that, and it does look good.
Boss fights in VR games are another thing that are super cool to me, because I don't know why I would think that it would be harder to do boss battles in VR. I guess because I'm thinking of, you know how bosses always have the health bar above their head, and you have to keep track of that while you fight them, and it's like an entire thing that you're doing mentally, trying to stay alive while also making sure that they are slowly dying at a rate that is quick enough that you'll eventually kill them. I always think of it like having that in VR, the combined experience of, oh my god, am I killing him fast enough and I need to stay alive, with a 3D world and this really immersive environment around you, just seems like such an awesome mixture and an awesome combination. How often have you been able to fight bosses in VR? Is this your first time being able to do that? Because it's a relatively new concept to me.
No, there's a couple of different games that have bosses in them, but they're all kind of, I don't know, forgettable? Even when they're a good game. And there's a couple of good dungeon crawlers. Dungeon crawling is one of the more popular genres when it comes to VR titles. You can see them, they're out there, and they tend to be mostly well done. I feel like people don't get into doing dungeon crawlers for VR titles unless they're going to do a pretty big one, because it's kind of a passion project thing, I feel. Generally speaking, the VR titles that I have seen that are dungeon crawlers tend to be some of the better games that are out there. They're well done, they tend to be much prettier, they've got cool new things, because they're taking these Dungeons and Dragons feelings, right, and they're turning them into VR, which is really kind of like the thing that VR wants. Like, that's what we want, is we want to be in Dungeons and Dragons. That's why people created Dungeons and Dragons.
Right? To roleplay, to imagine yourself in that world. And VR is a real way of doing that. It's amazing to think about. But another thing about boss battles that I would like to point out, whether this be in VR or not, if you can create a good boss, like a boss that is memorable, it leaves an impression on your game that people will never ever forget about. And I think that it's a really good idea for VR games that are going to do dungeon crawlers to try to invest in the creation side of the characters and trying to make the characters feel like something that is more personal. And in that way, you'll be left with a really strong impression of not only like the world that you just entered with VR, but also the characters that you experienced. And I can't wait until VR gets to a level where it's more about story and you have more intricate plot lines and character development. I think in the future that's going to be amazing.
That's one of those things that you see in the history of video games when you started having the first-person shooters from Doom and its various Doom clones, because that's what first-person shooters were called at the time. They weren't called first-person shooter, they were called Doom clones. When those first came out, you would see that they followed John Carmack's feeling that story doesn't belong in a shooter. And it took a long time until Half-Life and games like that, where you would start actually seeing story in a shooter. So I feel like we're in that period with regards to VR, where people are saying, no, they just want a 15-minute experience, and they just want to go in there and feel cool shooting stuff. And I feel like we're at that, where nobody's quite put together the, no, story is something we could do as well.
Right, so the progression of VR mirrors the progression of regular video games in that way. And it makes sense if you think about it during an early stage of development for them to think in this way. If we create a 15-minute experience, that's something that we can show off to people at an exposition. That's something that can get people hooked and say, oh my god, I have to have a headset. So right now, by doing that, they can build a market. They can build a collection of owners that actually have these headsets. But hopefully, once there's an established base there and there are millions and millions of people with headsets, they will then turn their attention to not hooking you in, but providing you with those types of experiences like Half-Life did in the 90s and what you and I were just talking about.
I'm hoping that we start to see that. This is a nascent technology, and if that's a word that you didn't understand, I'm sorry, but that's really what this is.
Google it. Just Google it, okay?
That's absolutely what this is. And you're going to see, with that kind of a technology, you don't get fully fleshed out anything. This is a good step towards that. You have a fully fleshed out dungeon crawler. It took 10 years to get a fully fleshed out dungeon crawler on PC.
This is a step in the right direction, and that's what it's doing. It's a fully fleshed out dungeon crawler, and maybe that's all it is at its core, but at least it's fully fleshed out. And that leaves the possibility open in the future for other genres, other games to be fully fleshed out. And that's what's really important if VR is going to take the steps that it needs to in order to become an entire experience that isn't just about being inside the headset. It's also about leaving your players with memories, and I think they can do that if they continue to work on the idea of let's produce a fleshed out product.
Plus, hey man, you've got that multiplayer in there, which is super neat because, well, multiplayer didn't follow for a while. So you've got multiplayer and a fully fleshed out dungeon crawler. It's a lot of fun. You can upgrade all sorts of stuff and really kind of get it going. I would recommend that they spend a little bit more time explaining how the cooldown system works and what these weapon pickups actually do and how you can access them, or if they're just upgrades that stack. That part was never really particularly clear to me, so I would like to see some more depth there, but that's it. That's the only complaint that I can even find, and I had to think for a few minutes before I even got to it. So I feel like this is a good pickup. This is going to be $20, like I said, but it's well worth the $20.
Good game. I recommend it as well.
That's Dungeons and Treasure. If you like it, like it. If you don't like it, don't like it. But if you did like it, go ahead and watch another one up there in the corner. And as always,
we'll see you guys on the next one.